The Kentucky archives hold a single water-stained page that refuses to let go of its secret. In faded ink and trembling script, it records an absence that still chills the county. More than a century later, Jeremiah O'Brien vanished from his Harrison County pig farm in the spring of 1847, and what replaced him was not an explanation, but a silence the town pretended was ordinary. Tonight I will pull that silence apart. Listen closely. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. And if these stories pull at you, subscribe and tell us where you're listening from, your town, your state, so this dark geography grows a little less lonely. The morning Jeremiah disappeared was the kind of dawn that felt like a held breath. Mist pooled between the tobacco rows, and the hollow where their cabin sat seemed closed off from the world, a private basin of rumor and survival. Catherine Flanagan arrived in Kentucky 3 years earlier, a red-haired woman from County Cork with hands shaped by toil and eyes that read people like books. She had been married to Jeremiah by arrangement. The church had facilitated a passage and a marriage contract signed with the practical expectations of survival. Jeremiah promised land and a pig operation. What she found was a collapsing barn, a handful of underfed hogs, and a man hollowed by drink and old war shadows. He was 15 years her senior, prematurely grey and fond of card games more than chores. She took to the work as if it were prayer, mending fences, feeding pigs, counting every coin. Under her care the herd grew from one to robust. She learned how to nurse sows, to coax vigor from thin livestock, a craft that in that place and time meant life or slow starvation. Yet Jeremiah kept slipping away into taverns and reckless debts, while letters she found revealed plans to sell what they had built and ride off toward California with another woman. When she confronted him, the argument shredded the brittle cover of their life. He struck, she defended, and what followed was a decisive, brutal moment that left Catherine with a choice. The law would not protect her, the court would not favor an Irish wife against a dead husband, and the world outside the hollow felt indifferent now. She acted with the terrible exactness of someone who had learned to make life or death into a problem of logistics. After the strike that ended Jeremiah's threat, Catherine wrapped herself in motion, tools gathered, the hearth stoked, old knives sharpened until they bit clean. She did what necessity demanded. She moved the body out of sight. She dealt with what could not remain. Yet I will not linger on the particulars in graphic terms. The truth needs witness, not spectacle. In that choice, she was not alone in American history. Women pushed to their limits have always made hard bargains with survival. She fed the pigs in a way that future neighbors would call miraculous and muffled, and she burned clothes and papers until only ash kept the shape of what had been. Then she stepped into the community and told the story she had chosen. Jeremiah had left at dawn for the promise of gold. He would send for her. People accepted the shape of the story because it fit older, easier narratives. Men go west, wives wait. The world wanted a tidy rhythm, and she supplied it. But there were fractures. Soon, creditors came with the heavy tone of inevitability, and Catherine sold livestock to answer debt collectors while keeping enough to maintain the farm's facade. And then something small and unaccountable began to ripple through Harrison County: the pigs. Those animals, once lean and rattled by hunger, swelled in size beyond the county's memory. A local butcher wrote in a ledger that he had purchased hogs that weighed more than any he had seen, and that the meat yielded a richness that fed a tavern's reputation for savory stew. Farmers grumbled and then gossiped. The county clerk, a man used to numbers and ledgers, made an odd entry in March of that year, an inventory that tracked an unusual gain in livestock weight on the O'Brien ledger. It was a dry, administrative note, but it would become the thread investigators tugged at decades later when they tried to reconstruct what had been deliberately hidden. Catherine watched these murmurs the way a hunter watches wind. She adjusted, smiled, and kept work moving. But the world beyond the hollow was shifting too. Newspapers that normally traded in small town shocks refused to print anything more than rumor, and the sheriff's eventual report, when it came, would be filed away and sealed. Tonight we follow that sealed trail. Listen, this is not fiction. The sheriff's report arrived like a polite refusal. It used measured, administrative phrases: sudden disappearance, no conclusive proof, and left the county with a tidy absence rather than an accusation. The priest, Father O'Connell, who had visited the farm more than once, later confessed that Catherine's demeanour after that morning was not remorseful but resolute, a practical clarity that made him uneasy. He advised prayer and moved on. The townspeople, eager for a stable narrative, accepted that Jeremiah had ridden west, and they returned to fields and church schedules. But paper tells more than a story in plain ink. Small accounts and ledgers began to collect anomalies, extra feed bills, hurried livestock sales, and an inventory notation in March that quietly recorded unusually heavy hog weights on the O'Brien books. A butcher's scribble praised the richness of meat from the O'Brien herd. A merchant quietly stopped asking questions when coins paid old debts. These administrative details were not dramatic, they were technical, bureaucratic, and therefore harder to dismiss. Catherine learned to live inside that thread, tending the show of normalcy while the farm itself kept producing the evidence of something less ordinary. She sold a few sows to pay creditors, kept the best animals for market, and made sure the barn looked always occupied. Neighbors watched with a mixture of relief and unease. Whispers traveled down the hollow, whispers that required proximity to be believed. Because silence had teeth, editors in the county seat declined to print rumors that would sully reputations, and merchant councils closed like shutters when questions became inconvenient. Yet sealing a file is a verdict. Someone influential insisted those pages stay closed, an act that smelled of protection. The speculator named in Jeremiah's papers suggested motives beyond a private quarrel. When institutions choose quiet over justice, truth becomes a private thing, lodged in ledgers and the long faces of neighbors who know more than they say. We will follow those ledger marks, because in them lies the map that historians and a few stubborn neighbors would later use to reconstruct what others tried to erase and reveal the truth. What finally unsettled the county's willingness to look away was not a shout but a ledger and the stubborn arithmetic of animal weight. The county clerk's inventory recorded a rise in average hog weight that did not align with feed patterns, seasons, or any ordinary husbandry practices of 1847. Those columns of numbers, when read across weeks, made a shape that accountants and farmers both recognized as abnormal. It suggested a schedule of feeding and an intensity of growth that demanded explanation. Catherine, practical and precise, had long been admired for her skill with pigs, but admiration mutates into suspicion when prosperity accelerates without visible cause. The butcher's notes and the clerk's weights crossed into rumor. Men who shortened their sentences at tavern tables began to speak in different tones when the O'Brien herd was mentioned. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Say it if you want to stand beside the history that refuses to be comfortable. The ledger did not by itself name a crime, but it offered a timeline that contradicted the story Catherine told the world. From the raw columns a new question emerged. What had been fed to those animals and when? Questions moved like a subterranean current through the hollow, felt rather than said aloud. Farmers know the rhythms of sow and piglet, and they can sense when something unusual has altered those rhythms. The clerk's inventory acted like an X-ray. It revealed a density where neighbors expected lightness. Editors who had declined to publish details now found their offices visited by traveling butchers and merchants repeating the same observations. A few brave neighbors began to ask questions at a distance, phrased as curiosity rather than accusation, because to accuse directly threatened social and economic ruin. Catherine answered with the same equanimity. She had practiced a measured nod, a payment and exchange of goodwills. Behind that performance, however, the ledger kept the story and the weight numbers accumulated into an argument no one could easily dismiss. Over time, the cluster of notes, invoices, and butcher remarks began to resemble evidence, a lattice of paper tracing a sequence of months and feedings. We will trace that lattice until secrets surface. After the ledger drew attention, other fragments of the story surfaced slowly, the way roots reveal themselves when a riverbank erodes. An elderly woman who lived near the Kellerman farm later recalled a pall of smoke the week after Jeremiah vanished, and the smell she could not name that hung over the O'Brien hollow. Children remembered a fire at the cabin, and someone noted a new pile of hay and manure that did not belong to ordinary chores. A traveling mender of boots mentioned seeing Jeremiah's jacket burn near the hearth when he passed through with a cartload of nails. None of these accounts were dramatic on their own. They were ordinary eyewitness things: a scent, a burned cloth, a quick sale of a sow. But taken together with a clerk's inventory and a butcher's note, the fragments formed a pattern that was hard to ignore. Rumors swelled at the edges and were met by an organized quiet from particular quarters. Persons of influence in town had reasons to keep certain matters private, not out of charity but because convenience and capital are often married in small communities. A land speculator's letters hinted at transactions and promises, and lawyers who worked those transactions had friends in judges' robes and in local presses. The sealing of parts of the investigative file felt like a polite handshake between property and silence. People who depended on those networks learned to alter their public voices. Some who might have demanded answers instead altered their ledgers. Catherine, astute in social calculation, used these currents to her advantage. She paid certain debts. She attended certain gatherings. She made small donations to parish relief so that what she needed to keep quiet became easier to keep quiet. Her moves were not merely avoidance. They were strategic investments in the calm required for survival. Outside the farm, the story hardened into two versions: the convenient tale that Jeremiah had left for California, and the grimmer account held by a few who collected ledgers and memories. Those two narratives ran parallel for decades, rarely intersecting in public but always bumping into each other in private. The deeper truth of what happened on that farm resided in the knot where ledger numbers met living memory, and it would take someone stubborn and literate to untie it. We will now follow those stubborn traces across testimonies and paper closely. What we must do as listeners is imagine the mind that chooses secrecy as a means of survival, because the motive is not simple and the moral horizon is narrow. Catherine had watched famine and hunger shape her family in County Cork. Survival was not abstraction but a daily curriculum. In Kentucky, she turned that curriculum into axe mend a fence, coax a sow, hide a coin beneath a floorboard. When Jeremiah's plan to abandon their work became clear, she felt an edge of finality that demanded decisive action. Her choice afterward followed a terrible arithmetic: remove the threat, erase the evidence, preserve the farm that made future life possible. That arithmetic is not heroic. It is a dark efficiency people invoke when institutions offer no protection. To understand Catherine is not to excuse her. It is to see the pressure of laws that denied women property and left them few legal remedies. Her knowledge of pigs provided a method. Husbandry teaches that animals will consume organic waste thoroughly, and practical farmers use that fact to manage a homestead. She used that knowledge and then learned to inhabit a new role: the competent widow who attends church and pays debts on time. In private, she was a woman who had crossed a line and crafted a life around its consequences. She paid creditors with plausible sales, kept the healthiest hogs, and arranged the yard so a casual visitor saw only routine labor. Neighbors reacted in different registers. Some praised her grit, others felt a chill in her measured smile. The village ran on reciprocities, and Catherine learned to invest just enough in those ties to avoid immediate exposure. Leaks appeared anyway, in a butcher's ledger, in a clerk's inventory, in a remembered scent at the cabin. Each small leak shaped a picture and increased pressure on a woman determined to move forward without public reckoning. Her post-spring life became a series of rituals, required constant vigilance, and choices later judged unthinkable. The ledger, with its columns and dates, would be one place historians could read that calculus of survival. We will listen to the ledger and to neighbors' small recollections, because together they form the uneasy geometry of a life rebuilt on a secret no town wished to name public. The county ledger that survived is a study in the banality of evidence: columns of dates and pounds, small notations that, when read as a sequence, begin to sketch the impossible. Farmers are literate in weight the way sailors are literate in wind. They can tell by ledger entries if feed has been altered or if an animal has been pushed past ordinary growth. In the O'Brien columns, the increase shows as a steady climb, not a single anomaly but a pattern stretching over weeks. Butchers noted the density of the cuts. Merchants commented on unusual yields of lard, and cooks in nearby inns remembered stews that seemed richer than tradition warranted. Those observations moved like small threads through the county's fabric, visible only if one looked for them. Catherine treated those threads as practical problems. She accounted for sales, recorded payments, and maintained a public face that suggested ordinary labor rather than extraordinary means. The ledger and the butcher's notes formed an argument outside her performance. The animals had been fed in ways that produced growth inconsistent with typical practice. The choice Catherine made after Jeremiah's death fused knowledge and necessity. Faced with laws that offered her little recourse and a community that would judge a woman harshly for stepping outside prescribed roles, she opted for a solution that made the farm sustainable again. Neighbors who suspected did not always speak because speaking threatened livelihoods. Who would buy pork from a woman whose name was tied to scandal? Who would lend money to a household under suspicion? Silence became valuable currency, and Catherine traded it with care. Over time, the ledger's columns accumulated weight until they compelled questions that polite records could not fully suppress. The sealed sheriff's report and the judge's quiet order suggested institutional pressure to keep certain pages closed, and that pressure shifted the burden of evidence toward private recollection and scattered paper. Thus, the story persisted outside official channels where memory and made lists did the work institutions would not. In this way, the facts of the farm became a private thing that a few held and many arranged their days to ignore, lodged inside clay soil and ledger ink. We will move from these ledgers to the human testimonies that add texture: the neighbor who smelled smoke, the child who saw a jacket burn, the merchant who noted the unusual meat, and memory. Testimonies are strange things. They resemble shards that catch light when the right angle is found. A Kellerman child recalled a smell and a fire near the O'Brien cabin. An itinerant cobbler remembered seeing clothing near a hearth that looked recently burned. A traveling merchant wrote in the margin of his ledger that a delivery from the O'Brien farm produced meat that patrons praised for its richness. These are not declarations or indictments. They are faint human impressions, fragments that historians stitch together with patient care. When multiplied and cross-checked, they begin to describe a sequence of events that the official record preferred to leave opaque. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Say those words if you want to anchor yourself to the history that refuses comfortable endings. Catherine's actions in the days after Jeremiah's disappearance found practical corroboration in these small observations, and yet they remained, to most neighbors, only gossip. The boot mender's note, the child's memory of clothing burned, the neighbor's notice of an extra pile of hay. Taken together with the clerk's inventory, they created a cadence that could not easily be ignored. Authorities moved slowly, and in the meantime the community accommodated a version of events that preserved commerce and reputations. A judge's order sealed the sheriff's file, and that order read as a public gesture that protected certain interests under the guise of legal propriety. Local editors, mindful of advertisers and a fragile economy, declined to publish the darker lines of the tale. None of this proves guilt in a court. It shows how social power arranges the facts that reach public view. Within that arrangement, Catherine functioned as a master of limited visibility. She paid certain debts, made strategic gestures to the parish, and allowed enough social currency to circulate so that direct accusation became both dangerous and costly. In towns where capital and favor intersect, silence is a policy and complicity its mechanism. The more the state apparatus chose quiet, the more the private ledger and local memories became the only archive of what might have happened. To hold those fragments together, we must be willing to sit with discomfort. The neat outlines of law often mask messy moral bargains. This is the moment where hidden agendas and institutional convenience turn a life into a secret that preserves property over accountability. In the years that followed Catherine's management of the farm, the O'Brien hogs developed a reputation that spread beyond Harrison County. Prosperity at the margins provokes questions about origin and stewardship. Catherine used that advantage to stabilize her life. She paid creditors, repaired mortgage damage, and tended the barn. To some, she became a local success, the woman who turned a failing property profitable. To others, she remained an enigma whose smile never quite reached her eyes. Profit bought choices, she selected discreet buyers and avoided sales that might draw prying attention. Those economic ties formed another layer of protection. Commerce functioned as a buffer between rumor and public inquiry. Institutions completed the buffer: a sealed report, sympathetic judges, and a press mindful of advertisers combined to keep the public record clean. When the clerk's inventory and the butcher's notes were later examined by researchers, they read like patient, numerical witnesses to a policy of omission. The documents implied rather than declared, but their pattern held the weight of suspicion when read against custom and dates. Historians and local scholars, unwilling to accept convenience, began to map sales feed patterns and the judge's order that locked pages away. Those mappings revealed not only Catherine's methods, but also the network of relationships that allowed her choices to remain unexamined in public. It was a system in which property interests and reputation overlapped, producing an outer ring of social silence. This is the anatomy of small-town power when profit leans on discretion. Institutions adapt to protect those who benefit. Catherine moved within that anatomy and used its protections, whether deliberately or by necessity. The moral calculus of her actions remained contested between the keepers of ledger and the keepers of memory, and that tension would be where truth slowly emerged. In taverns and at market stalls the story persisted in different tones. Old timers crossed themselves when the O'Brien name was mentioned, and women at kitchen tables spoke in lowered voices as if touching a taboo. A neighbor remembered Jeremiah boasting of a sale, and a woman recalled spotting a cart by dawn. These oral fragments were unreliable alone, but together they filled gaps left by sanitized records. By juxtaposing memory and paper, historians could see both the calculus of a desperate woman and the social architecture that sheltered her. Next, we opened the sealed pages and listened to their quiet testimony. Researchers who later pried open courthouse trunks found the sheriff's pages folded with care and stamped with the judge's quiet hand. The report contained interviews written in blunt, rural diction, a boot mender's note about burned clothing, a merchant's passing observation about an unusual delivery, and an entry where the sheriff recorded that neighbors had heard raised voices on the morning Jeremiah was last seen. There was no dramatic confession, only small attentions that suggested a domestic rupture and a response that bent towards secrecy. Alongside those interviews rested the county clerk's inventory, an ordinary set of columns annotated in a clerk's tidy hand showing animal weights, sales dates, and buyer names. Mapped across the spring weeks, these entries presented the anomaly that had made later readers stare. A cluster of weight increases that occurred just after Jeremiah's disappearance and before the major sales that paid creditors. The sequence implied a timeline in which nourishment and disposal overlapped, and that overlap reframed a suggested explanation of a man gone west into a question about what the herd had consumed. Father O'Connell's notes appeared too, brief and pastoral, recording a woman who asked about protection and property. His marginalia hinted at pastoral concern rather than forensic certainty. The sheriff remained cautious but noted the O'Brien ledger as unusual and troubling. That offhand line, placed between careful testimonies and numerical entries, became a hinge on which later interpretation swung. Who had insisted the file be sealed? The judge's order left no public rationale. It simply closed pages that some fingers had marked for closer inspection. When those pages were unlocked, it became possible to match ledger dates to village memories, a burned garment, a cart at odd hours, the sudden glut of lard entering local markets. Taken together, the materials did not form a courtroom-ready indictment. They did something older and quieter. They made the outline of a human decision legible. Today, the state's archives preserve those documents as fragments whose arrangement suggests choice, accident, and collusion in roughly the same measure. As we read the clerk's columns and the sheriff's sober lines, we are reading a social mechanism at work. How knowledge circulates, how property is protected, and how silence is manufactured. The sealed file did not bury truth. It delayed the hour at which a handful of patient readers would begin to reweave these strands into a fuller account. As historians untangled ledgers and memories, a pattern emerged that often repeats in older communities: the intersection of profit, reputation, and the will to preserve both. Those intersections produce an architecture of silence where inconvenient facts are managed by social rituals, by economic exchanges, and by legal interventions that do not always speak their names. In Harrison County, the pattern looked like this: a judge's quiet order, a press that preferred advertisers over scandal, merchants who accepted discreet sales, and neighbors who learned when to close their mouths. These mechanisms did not require a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. They functioned as habits and incentives that pushed conversation away from dangerous topics. Catherine navigated this architecture with a practical intelligence that repurposed local customs in her favor. She paid off debts selectively, made small gestures to parish work, and used the farm's output as a means of smoothing relations. On the surface it read like social dexterity. Below it was an exploitation of a system that prioritized property and commerce over transparent justice. To understand this is to see the broad machinery of social control, institutions and norms that shield certain actors and that measure consequences differently depending on who holds title or cash. Ancient corruption is not only coded in dramatic scandals, it is often procedural, embedded in the ways officials record and choose what to seal. When records close, memory and ledger become the two archives people must consult to approach truth. And memory is fallible, whereas ledgers speak in numbers that appear objective until you begin to ask how those numbers were generated. In the O'Brien case, the numbers suggested feeding patterns and sales schedules that aligned inconveniently with Jeremiah's disappearance. Those alignments forced readers to imagine motives and consequences that legal texts did not address. Who benefits when a man's absence is converted into profit? Who gains when the public record is polite enough to be unthreatening? Those questions lead to institutions that prefer order to probing inquiry. Catherine's choices therefore cannot be read only as an individual's moral failing or survival skill. They sit inside a social topology that made certain responses available and protected. When we read the ledger and the sealed report together, we see a system at work, one that converts private acts into public silence and makes economic stability the currency that buys discretion. We will pry at it. Years compressed into routine. Catherine's days became measured cycles of chores, ledgers, and small performances that kept neighbors comfortable and creditors at bay. She aged into a woman whose hair lightened and whose hands retained the callous of constant labor. Her success at pig husbandry solidified into a local expertise people relied upon, even if they never quite spoke the reasons for such success aloud. Seasons rolled into markets and fairs, and the O'Brien hogs kept returning to town as dependable sources of income for buyers and the farm alike. Private moments visited her like questions without answers, a sleep interrupted by a remembered raised hand, a scent that recalled smoke, a dream shaped like a ladle and a fence post. Those moments did not become confession, they became internalized memory she carried like a secret ledger. Praised for industry, she was nevertheless watched by a community that measured propriety and rumor against practical benefit. Silence had an economy and participation bought protection. Catherine paid in small offerings of grain, help, and discreet payments to avoid conversations that might unsettle commerce. In the legal record, she remained a peripheral figure. The sealed pages kept their quiet, and public legal attention drifted elsewhere over the decades. Few asked direct questions, and fewer still had the means or will to pursue a prosecution that would destabilize community ties. Neighbors kept their own ledger of impressions. Admiration for a woman's work mixed with a persistent discomfort born of stories that did not fully align with documented numbers. People are adept at maintaining cognitive distance from things they do not wish to investigate. Economies of attention direct interest away from inconvenient truths. Catherine continued to run the farm, paid off debts, and secured modest stability by labor and management of perception. Her life after that spring morning was a slow accretion of decisions that kept her alive and her farm afloat. As the years moved on, the full weight of what had been done settled into archives and memory, to be summoned only by the patient and the persistent. One day, decades later, a scholar with attention to both numbers and neighborhood stories would peel back the town's polite forgetting and begin to assemble the scattered archive and speak. The scholar who came later was not a detective in the melodramatic sense, but a patient reader of small things, margin notes, ledger columns, and marginal gossip recorded in diaries. She sat in the state archives among moth-eaten bundles and water-stained pages and listened to paper as if it were testimony. Her method was eccentric to locals. She cross-referenced sale dates with funeral notices, matched butcher invoices to market schedules, and tracked the names that appeared repeatedly as buyers. She also spoke quietly to descendants who retained household lore, and to a few old families who still remembered the hush that fell in certain rooms when the O'Brien name appeared. Those oral histories supplied texture to the clerk's cold numbers and gave the ledger a human beat. As she built timelines, the narrative began to cohere: arguments at dawn, a violent confrontation, a hurried concealment, and a series of sales that relieved immediate financial pressure. But the scholar did not stop at causality. She traced the social scaffolding that had permitted such an event to be managed into silence. Her notes showed how commerce and small favors produced institutional reluctance to probe too deeply, and how the cost of asking could be immediate and material. Once she presented her findings at a small conference, the reception was mixed. Academics applauded the rigor, while some locals bristled at the reopening of a polite wound. Newspapers that had once declined to print details now wrote cautiously about what the archives disclosed, and letters arrived asking whether it was right to disturb settled memories. The scholar's work did what archives do: it turned private fragments into public questions, and it forced a community to address the ways it had chosen to look away. Some descendants reacted with anger, others with relief that the ledger had finally been read aloud. The process of publication did not erase ambiguity. Legal culpability remained a matter of conjecture in the absence of living witnesses, and moral judgment hovered like a question mark. Yet the scholar's mapping had accomplished something crucial. It created a frame where memory, ledger, and law could be compared, and where choices could be understood within a social context. In the end, the story did not fit neatly into a courtroom drama, but it offered a sharper perspective on how survival, law, and silence had braided together on a single Kentucky farm. Publication changed the terms of conversation. What had been private rumor and ledger notes became a public narrative that people had to situate in their sense of identity and community. Some locals defended Catherine as a resourceful widow who saved a farm and who did what was necessary to survive in a harsh legal landscape. Others condemned her actions as monstrous and demanded a moral accounting, even if the law could not now reach the matter. The parish debated whether to remove mention of the family from memorials. Merchants worried about the reputation of products that bore the Hollow's name. Tensions exposed the differing ways a community holds memory. Some prioritize continuity and commerce. Others seek a clarity that cleans the soul at the price of communal peace. Debate shifted quickly into the realm of hidden agendas. Those who had closed files once claimed procedural propriety, while critics suggested that economic interests had dictated judicial discretion. New questions were raised about who benefited from silence and whether institutional decisions favored private property over public morality. Descendants of those who had once profited quietly now found themselves in the uncomfortable light of historical scrutiny. Letters to local papers and heated meetings at the county seat discussed restitution, apologies, and whether a plaque acknowledging the complicated past should be erected. Legal experts insisted that time barred prosecution, and historians argued that legal limits do not settle ethical questions. Instead, the town faced the harder task of social reckoning, ritual apology, and the acknowledgement of institutional failure where it had occurred. For some families, the scholar's investigation was a wound. For others, it was a remedy that cleansed a persistent unease. The controversy revealed another layer of the story: the way institutions often protect economic order, and the human costs of that protection. When property rights and the desire for a quiet market intersect, communities will often choose the market, and moral accounting becomes deferred until a patient historian compels remembrance. The debate continues in town halls and kitchen tables. The scholar's voice insisted that truth matters even when the price is discomfort. We must step back and look at what Catherine's story reveals about systems larger than a single farm. It reveals how laws that deny agency to certain people create grisly choices, how property regimes can reshape moral horizons, and how social networks translate economic self-interest into enforced silence. These patterns are not exotic. They are the framework of a rural legal culture that valued land title and exchange above the messy moral calculus of individual survival. When a woman's life rests on the outcome of a deed, and when courts prefer order to inconvenient probing, survival strategies will take forms that shock later readers. The O'Brien case is a study in that dynamic. It shows a woman acting within a lattice of constraints that included gendered law, economic precarity, and social incentives for silence. To study the case is to look at the scaffolding of coercion as well as at the single agent who used expertise and calculation to survive. Psychological control enters here as an ambient force, not necessarily wielded by an individual but embedded within norms and expectations. Catherine felt the pressure of legal invisibility and social contempt and learned to marshal practical control over the aspects of life she could command. Animals, barns, ledgers. That mastery became a way of remaking identity in a world that offered few alternatives. But mastery can be morally ambiguous. It can shelter survival and perpetuate harm simultaneously. The O'Brien farm teaches us that forbidden decisions are sometimes calculated answers to systems that leave spotty moral options. When historians pry at ledgers and memory, they illuminate not only acts but the social machine that permitted those acts to seem pragmatic rather than monstrous. This is part of our broader story. Institutions often prefer stability and capital to the messy work of moral accounting, and this preference creates histories that are uncomfortable and instructive. As listeners, you are implicated in this lesson. How will you respond to systems that nudge ethical compromise in your own communities? The question is not simply historical, it is practical and present tense, because institutions still shape incentives that reward quiet profit over public reckoning. To hear Catherine's story is to feel an invitation to reconsider the invisible rules that order local life, and to ask whether the conveniences we accept are bought at moral cost. Identity shifts. What was once a passive observer becomes an active witness. Catherine lived out her days managing the farm she had secured. She did not stand trial, nor was she publicly arraigned in a court of law. Her death came quietly, as so many small lives in rural places do, marked by a notice in a local paper that spoke of a life of industry and of a steady neighbor without delving into contested pasts. For many, the official ending fit the community's preference for continuity. The barn stayed intact, buyers still sought O'Brien pork, and the mortgage ledger closed. But for those who kept ledgers of a different sort, memory, rumor, and archival curiosity, the story remained unsettled. The lack of legal reckoning did not erase the moral questions the case raised. If anything, it amplified them by showing how law and social interest could diverge. In some houses, older people still cross themselves when the O'Brien name comes up, and in kitchens down hollow roads the story passes in a whisper, like a talisman meant to ward off similar choices. The lesson many drew in Harrison County was not a lesson of simple condemnation, but of caution about how institutions are arranged and whom they protect. Property and stability, the town learned, can be defended at the cost of discomfort, and choosing stability can be a communal decision disguised as prudence. The scholar's publication forced a communal accounting of memory and paper, and asked whether silence had been purchased on terms the county could still accept. For some the answer was no, and for others the answer remained a reluctant yes. That division is itself instructive. It reveals the differing priorities that a small place can hold simultaneously without resolving them. Catherine's story thus functions as a mirror. It shows what a community is willing to sacrifice to keep markets calm and reputations intact. Her personal moral calculus remains a subject for debate, and historians will continue to argue whether her acts were primarily survival or a calculated exploitation of a permissive system. There is no neat closure. Ledger and memory, legal silence and moral rumination coexist uneasily indeed. What do we take from stories like Catherine O'Brien's? First, that history is not only what courts prosecute but also what communities choose to remember or forget. It is a field of choices made by people who have incentives, and those incentives are often economic, social, or legal rather than purely moral. Second, that individuals exercise agency inside structures that both constrain and enable actions. Survival strategies look different depending on the tools available. Third, that institutions are rarely neutral. They embody preferences and priorities that shape outcomes in subtle but powerful ways. When you read the ledger and the sealed report, you read the fingerprint of a social system that prioritized property and quiet markets. That prioritization had human consequences that played out in a narrow hollow in Kentucky and in countless places beyond. These are not merely historical abstractions. They are living patterns that inform modern life. Consider how incentives shape choices in any institution you know, the workplace, a school board, a local court, or a neighborhood association. Wherever systems reward silence or stabilize reputations above messy accountability, the same logic that protected silence on the O'Brien farm can reappear. Understanding that reality is not an invitation to despair but a call to attention, institutions can be changed if citizens insist upon transparency, accountability, and procedures that do not default to protecting only property interests. Change requires both documentation and courage. The scholar who read the clerk's columns had the first, and the townspeople who debated the legacy provided the second in fits and starts. To engage is to practice a discipline of attention, collect the small documents, listen to memory, and be willing to follow patterns even when they point toward uncomfortable conclusions. As listeners, you are invited into that discipline. The story asks you to be a witness, not a judge. Witnessing does not mean endorsing every act, but refusing complacency when institutions prefer quiet over truth. The work is ongoing, and the O'Brien ledger is only one map among many. But it is an important one because it demonstrates how moral questions and institutional structures entangle, producing consequences that echo for generations. If you hold the mirror to your own community, you may find similar shadows. Naming them is the first step toward changing the incentives that shape choices. Begin by reading local records, asking officials questions, and supporting transparency in your community. Return to the hollow where the O'Brien farm sits and picture the fog in which choices were made, not grand conspiracies, but small grinding logistics folded into daily survival. Catherine's story is a lens showing how desperation, law, custom, and economic interest braid into outcomes that seem inevitable only after the fact. As your guide, I will not offer a simple label, monster or martyr, but ask you to hold both until your understanding deepens. Patient work often produces moral clarity after time and scrutiny. In this case, that work altered a county's memory and produced a ledger with its own voice. Those administrative traces are the bones of a communal decision about what to protect and what to forget. If you take one lesson away, it is this: systems shape decisions, and when systems favor property and quiet markets over inquiry, they make impossible choices likelier. That is both an intellectual point and an ethical one, because it invites you to interrogate the institutions around you. Listen to ledger and memory. They will not always agree, and that disagreement is where meaning is made. Watching a community choose calm over clarity reveals how psychological governance operates. Implicit rules that manage attention and calibrate conscience. These rules reframe certain acts as pragmatic rather than monstrous, and thus make silence a practical currency. To see this is to accept a responsibility, question incentives in institutions, preserve transparency, and resist systems that normalize ethical compromise. There is no tidy ending in archives, only pages, people, and choices that ripple outward through generations. But if you carry this story into your own town, if you read the small ledgers, listen to kitchen memories, and ask difficult questions, you join the patient work that brings quiet facts into public light. For anyone whose sense of self shifts through this listening, adopt a small practice. Keep asking, keep reading, refuse the convenience of silence. That practice is the antidote to the architecture that once sheltered silence in Harrison County. In doing this, you do not cancel complexity, you honor it, and you transform from passive observer into active witness. This is how forbidden histories are slowly dethroned, and how communities begin to choose accountability over calm.